With the overwhelming majority of cars that we discuss in Unsung Heroes, I tend to be quite a big fan of them. Sometimes I even love the car. Other times, though, it's a vehicle that deserves to be talked about, I think, but that I don't necessarily love personally. And for me, this is one of those occasions. The car in question is, of course, as you saw from the title, a Vector. Now, anyone who's played Gran Turismo for some time, or at least has followed this channel for a few days, will have seen Vector referenced, because a few days ago, I reviewed another Vector model from Gran Turismo 2, and we've actually reviewed all three of them now, because there were three included. There was the Vector Weegut W8 Twin Turbo, there's the M12, which is my personal favourite model that they've built, the M12 LM race car, which is technically an interpretation of the GT2 race car that they had in 1998, and then there's this one. This one's probably the most forgotten car that Vector ever built, the SRV8, sometimes referred to as the M12 SRV8, but technically, although similar, it is a very different vehicle, and that's kind of why it was both a good idea, but ultimately a failure, because a lot of the things that this car tried to do, I actually have a lot of support for. In some ways, especially. Now, to understand why this car deserves to be an unsung hero, we do actually need to discuss the company and the M12 in particular beforehand. Now, as I said, the M12 is my personal favourite car, from Vector, that is, but I think that the M12 unfortunately missed out on an opportunity of being arguably the most important American supercar at the time. Because the Ford GT had not debuted, the Saleen S7 was not around, Mosler had not made a big enough name yet, and even companies like Callaway were more focused in on racing than road cars. So there weren't really many, if any other, major American supercars. And of course stuff like the Corvette and the Viper, they're not supercars, they're sports cars. So this pretty much had that angle of the market, if you will, to itself. And it offered a lot. It had this big Lamborghini V12 engine, the styling looked kind of like a combination of Diablo front end and Ferrari F50 back end, plus it's American, and Americans love to buy American stuff. That's one of the great things about the American market. You guys love your own vehicles, and that's a very good thing. It's good for a self-sustaining economy. Now this is where the SRV8 comes in, because part of what I was just saying about that economy was what led to this vehicle's creation. Because in the mid-90s, another company forcibly took over Vector in a hostile takeover. And this company was called Megatech, a company based in Bermuda. And they took over the company, of course, from Jerry Weegut, who founded the brand. One of the cars is even named after him. And then they produced the M12. So that's pretty good so far. My favourite car of theirs, that's not a bad start. However, the car did not sell well, and that's kind of surprising to me. I would have thought Americans would have loved a big, flashy V12 American supercar, but apparently not. Then in racing, it wasn't really a success either. So what they decided to do is use what they'd learned from racing it, and even some of the parts of the race car itself, literally stuff like the chassis and the suspension mounts, and refurbish, if you will, the M12 into something new. Now what they did went beyond just that, because it has the chassis of the GT2 car. You can even see from the body panels, from some of the components such as the rear wing, the intakes, the revised visuals, it's very much so a product of that race car. That's a great start. It's a brilliant start. You could argue it would only make the car better, because of course anyone who's watched an old school episode of, I believe it was Top Gear, where Clarkson himself actually drove the Vector M12, he said it was a fantastic handling car already, so you could safely assume that the SRV8 was probably even better, given that the road car was already great, and then they essentially made this as kind of like a homologated GT2 road car, which is again an awesome idea. But it went beyond that, because potentially they went one better. Instead of using this big 5.7 litre Lamborghini V12, they kept the same capacity of 5.7 litre, but they brought it in-house, if you will, to a GM-sourced LT1 Chevy engine. In particular, the Corvette engine of the 90s. Now, the disadvantage of that is it doesn't have the power of the Lambo V12, at least in its standard form. You're looking more like 300, 350 horsepower. Not exactly supercar territory, but The vehicle was lighter, had a race-derived chassis, more downforce. All of this is great stuff. Once again, Mosler, for instance, with the MT900, also from America, didn't have a huge amount of power when it first came out, but it was a fantastic exotic. But in particular, the main choice behind this swap from an Italian V12 to an American V8 was not too surprisingly because it was cheaper and easier to manufacture, while keeping an exotic car in the range. Unfortunately, though, the reason why this car was mostly forgotten is because within literally days of making this prototype that you can see in the video, the company shut down. And ultimately, this is the only one in existence. They only ever built the one car. So technically, it's actually one of the rarest supercars ever built, and also one of the most desirable American supercars ever built. Now, I'm not sure what the actual power output would be, because it depends if they tuned that engine. If they didn't, then you're probably still looking at around 350 horsepower, so the top speed, for instance, probably wouldn't be as high as the regular M12, but it would have probably been a better track car, because of the reasons that I mentioned earlier. However, if they did, for instance, turbo or supercharge it, or even just modify it in general with better parts, such as cams, valves, etc., you could easily put out a lot more power than the Corvette block naturally had. It's one of the best engines in the world for tuning, after all, so that remains open. But ultimately, I think it's a strange situation because I'm actually not really a fan of this car itself in terms of its appearance. I think it has a very tacky interior, and ultimately it's some of the worst aspects of the 90s in terms of style. But I do love that they tried to make it more marketable, to make more of a success. Instead of just scrapping the M12, they saw that it was a good idea, just not necessarily executed in the right way. Unfortunately, this car wasn't really executed apparently in the right way either, because the company went down, and the car never had the chance again. Vector has pretty much remained gone since then, and although supercar brands come back and ebb and flow all the time, for now at least, things are pretty quiet. There were some rumblings and a potential returning car. You've probably seen pictures of it on the internet, a strange looking matte black thing with Toyota Supra headlights. Not a fan of that one myself, but a return of Vector would certainly be cool, and if there was ever an era for it to return, the 2010s and 2020s, could be a pretty good time. It's a good time for supercars and hypercars, so who knows what could happen in the future. Ultimately, though, that's it for this episode, and of course, if you want to check out previous episodes, and also if you're watching this down the line, episodes that come out after this one, then click right here on screen to see all of them. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.